again. This is another sign of the times, an analysis, and a commentary. It is time for the spiritual and physical manifestation of the book of Revelation. In other words, it's time for the fulfillment of prophecy. Revelation chapter 17, verse 9. And here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads or 7 mountains on which the woman stands or sits. 10. And there are 7 kings or leaders. 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space or time. 11. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goes into perdition. 12. And the 10 horns which thou saw are 10 kings or leaders, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings or leaders 1 hour with the beast. 13. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. 14. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords, and King of kings, and they that are with him are called, and chosen, and faithful. 15. And he said unto me, the waters which thou saw, where the whore sits or stands, are peoples, and multitudes, and nations, and tongues or languages. President Obama urges global united front against radicals like ISIS. President Obama has called on Americans and more than 60 nations to join the fight against violent extremism, saying they had to counter the ideology of the Islamic State and other groups making increasingly sophisticated appeals to young people around the world. Mr. Obama undercutting the Sunni militant group's message and blunting its dark appeal was a generational challenge that would require cooperation from mainstream Muslims, as well as governments, communities, religious leaders, and educators. We have to confront squarely and honestly the twisted ideologies that these terrorist groups use to incite people to violence. Mr. Obama told an auditorium full of community activists, religious leaders, and law enforcement officials, some of them skeptical about his message, gathered at the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door to the White House. We need to find new ways to amplify the voices of peace and tolerance and inclusion, and we especially need to do it online. But, Mr. Obama said, we are not at war with Islam. We are at war with people who have perverted Islam. So he said, White House officials cast the summit meeting as a rallying cry and progress report following Mr. Obama's speech on terrorism to the United Nations General Assembly in September, and said it signaled Mr. Obama's desire to play the leading role in assembling an international coalition to fight an ideological war against the Islamic State, also known as ISIS or ISIL. They said the battle was just as important as a military campaign Mr. Obama launched against ISIS in Iraq and Syria last summer, which has shown mixed results. Despite the president's call to arms, many of the leaders and officials attending the conference expressed doubt about the ability of the Obama administration to counter extremist messages, particularly from the Islamic State, which has a reach and agility in social media that far outstrips that of the American government. We're being outdone, both in terms of content, quality, and quantity. and in terms of amplification strategies. There appears to be a monumental gap between the Islamic State, which uses social media apps like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and other groups and governments, including the Obama administration. The problem is that governments are ill-placed to lead in the battle of ideas. It seems to be the communications problem of our time. Administration officials acknowledge the problems they face. You could hypothetically eliminate the entire ISIL safe haven, but still face a threat from the kind of propaganda they disseminate over social media, said Benjamin J. Rhodes, the Deputy National Security Advisor. It's an undervalued part of how you prevent terror attacks in the United States. At the same time, human rights activists at the summit said they had grave concerns about domestic efforts to counter violent extremism, known inside the government by the acronym CVE. They said that programs to spot potential homegrown terrorists could morph into fear-mongering closet surveillance efforts that trample on civil rights and privacy, and that the administration could also be giving tacit approval to foreign governments that abuse human rights in the name of countering terrorism. A coalition of advocacy groups has written to the White House raising their concerns, and some Muslim American community groups boycotted the summit meeting in protest. The government must behave in a way so that victims of hate crimes and violent extremism know that government agencies are there to protect their rights and safety, not just monitor their religious and political expression, said the president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. This focus solely on attacks committed by Arabs or Muslims reinforces the stereotype of Arab and Muslim Americans as security threats, and thus perpetuates hatred of the respected communities. Mr. Obama said that other countries had a responsibility to help. If we're going to prevent people from being susceptible to the false promises of extremism, then the international community has to offer something better, Mr. Obama said, adding that the United States would do its part by promoting economic growth and development, fighting corruption, and encouraging other countries to devote more resources to education, including for girls and women. When governments oppress their people, deny human rights, stifle dissent, or marginalize ethnic and religious groups, or favor certain religious groups over others, it sows the seed of extremism and violence, Mr. Obama said. It makes those communities more vulnerable to recruitment. There is a very profound conceptual disagreement about whether the best way to counter violent extremism is through human rights and civil society or through an iron fist. The Obama administration wants to project the human rights side, but you look at the people they're working with and fighting alongside, and there's a lot more to it than that. In other words, this is not a simple problem that can be solved easily or quickly. The president of the advocacy group Human Rights First, who had attended the meeting and was struck by the juxtaposition of rhetoric and reality, were sitting in that room with representatives of governments that are part of the problem. If the president believes what he's saying, then the actions that these governments are taking are undermining our supposedly shared agenda. Other critics say the terrorism fight has simply enabled autocratic regimes to go after their political foes without worrying about American disapproval. Egypt's leaders, for instance, have moved to stifle the Muslim Brotherhood, the opposition group they deem too radical. It is futile to distinguish between bad terrorists which must be defeated, and good terrorists, which can be accommodated. People who are not happy with the establishment sometimes find in ISIS a counterforce for reasons that might be associated with ideology or might not. There is a huge credibility gap between Arab governments and their people. Nothing governments are saying is taken or believed by the public in general, and so that needs to change. The White House acknowledged the disconnect between advocating human rights and teaming up with human rights violators, but aides said it was one Mr. Obama had learned to live with, given the importance of maintaining an international coalition to fight the Islamic State and other terror threats. It's a perennial challenge of the United States government that some of our partners are much more aggressive than others in how they define their domestic terrorist challenge, said Benjamin J. Rhodes, a Deputy National Security Advisor to Mr. Obama. That dynamic is most obvious in Egypt, where essentially there's been a very broad brush in terms of who represents a terrorist threat. He said the Obama administration would continue to press allies to balance the fight against terrorists with tolerance of political opponents. All we can do there is be straightforward, Mr. Rhodes said. We don't want to feed a sense of grievance that goes beyond the groups that are necessary to target. And Egypt was not the only country represented at the conference with a spotty record on human rights or democracy. Some nations who sent ministers and officials included Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Uganda, and the United Arab Emirates, among others. In promoting democracy and freedom as part of the solution to terrorism, Mr. Obama is returning to a theme he has advanced episodically in the past, and one that his predecessor, President George W. Bush, made the centerpiece of his second inaugural address in 2005. Mr. Obama, like Mr. Bush, argued that oppression, corruption, and injustice created openings for extremists to exploit disgruntled young people. When people spew hatred towards others because of their faith or because they're immigrants, it feeds into terrorist narratives, Mr. Obama said. It feeds a cycle of fear and resentment, and a sense of injustice upon which extremists prey, and we can't allow cycles of suspicion to tear the fabrics of our countries. Yet, as he embraced a message similar to his predecessors, Mr. Obama offered less emphasis on force than Mr. Bush was known for. Mr. Obama condemned recent terrorist attacks, but did not present terrorism as an existential threat, like Mr. Bush did, nor did he use some of the phrases Mr. Bush used to refer to Islamic radicalism. Republican critics said the conference missed the point, dismissing it as a feel-good exercise when the president should instead be stepping up his military campaign against the Islamic State. So they say. And again, Revelation chapter 16, verse 8, And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. 9. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which has power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. 10. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom or nation was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain. Yes, and all these are more signs.